Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to have a go at another Rastar model. This time we've got a GT500 Mustang to play with. There was a few of these on eBay a couple of weeks ago for 75 quid or so, which is way too much for what they are. Although being a properly licensed product will put the price up, but they're really not worth that much. While I was looking at the expensive listings, this one popped up. It's used and the box is a bit tatty, but considering we're going to gut it and fit hobby grade electronics, it should be more than good enough. I ended up paying 20 quid for it, which is far more reasonable. Now we're not going to bother with the unboxing, but suffice to say it's got the same clicky bang bang radio as the Land Rover came with, except with Ford logos. The model itself is very nicely moulded. It really does look rather good. There's a full interior with a steering wheel and all the other gubbins. Underneath there's a bit of detail moulded into the chassis, and there's a battery door to fit a bunch of AA's to run the stock toy grade electronics. At the back we've got a gear differential, which is quite handy to help with the turning circle. None of these Rastar models have an especially good steering lock, so every little helps. Now because it's second hand, there's a few marks. There's a small gouge in the roof just above the windscreen. There's also a bit of a scuff on the bonnet, so I guess it's been flipped over at some point. And not too surprisingly, the front bumpers look like they've seen many skirting boards. None of that's much of a problem though, as we're going to end up painting it, so it's a bit different from the red and the blue Rastar do out of the box. Separating the body and the chassis is nice and straightforward. There's 8 Phillips head self-tappers that need to come out. They're all done up very tight and need a bit of careful persuasion to start turning. Make sure the screwdriver's firmly pressed into the screw head and be very careful not to let it slip. Pop all 8 of the screws out and the body should come away from the chassis. The main thing is not to use brute force to pull it off. You can work around and gently pull and stretch it until it pops free from the chassis. Don't lift it too far off though. There's the wires that go from the PCB to the lights and the antenna. Now since we're not going to be reusing any of the stock electronics, we're just going to use some cutters and snip the wires at the PCB. There's no need to do anything special with them. In addition to the LED wires, we'll also snip the drive motor wires, the battery box wires, and the steering motor wires. Now we just need to remove the screws attaching the PCB to the front of the chassis and remove it. While we're here, we might as well remove the on-off switch. It's only held in with 2 screws, and we're going to end up reusing it with a new ESC. But we need to make sure that the hot glue that they've squirted all over it is removed so we can get at the terminals for soldering. We might as well snip the rest of the battery wires as we're not going to be needing them, and it will make pulling the terminals out a bit easier. And there's also the motor wires that we won't be needing. We might as well cut those too. Well, that's starting to look a bit neater. I've got the same steering servo mount on the printer that I designed for the Land Rover, and from a quick look it should fit. The steering motor gearbox is the same. Unfortunately it isn't quite as easy as it first appeared, but more on that later. Here's the finish mount. It's exactly the same as the Land Rover one, along with the little adapter that fits to the steering linkage. To fit it, we need to remove the front platform on the chassis. It's held in with 4 self-tappers. Unscrew them and it just lifts away. Watch out though, the steering hubs have fairly strong springs on them, and if you're not careful they'll try very hard to ping off and get lost in the carpet. Next, the steering gearbox comes out, and it's only held on with 2 screws in opposite corners. The other 2 just hold the 2 halves of the case together. Remove the gearbox and the steering linkage. The last bit to come out is the centering spring. There's only the 1 washer head screw, so pop that out and you can lift the metal bits from the chassis. Then from the underside we just need to turn the center adjuster 90 degrees and remove it. To put it all back together with a new servo mount, first we need to fit the adapter to the steering linkage. Now I don't have the ball end yet, so this is just going to be a test fit. It just slots into the hole in the linkage and locates over the post that's normally used for centering. Then to hold it on we just use an M3x6 from the bottom. The one that I fitted to the Land Rover seems to be holding up just fine, so at the very least this bit's going to carry over. The servo mount goes in now. It fits over the same post and uses the same screws as the stock gearbox. Now we're not going to bother fitting a servo yet, as we're going to have to take it out again to put the linkage together later. The wheels on the hubs drop back in and the top plate goes on the top. You just have to keep it squeezed up as the springs will try their best to pop it all apart. With the 4 screws back in, we can see there's a problem. The top plate is curved around the servo mount. Now on the Land Rover there's just a tiny bit more clearance. This one has a couple of webs on the underside of the top plate that get in the way. Now we could just grind the webs away, but it turns out there's a couple of other little niggles too. So while I sort out an updated mount, let's get on with the body. In short, what we need to do is remove all the screws and unclip all the little bits and bobs. Now it's not the easiest thing to do. You can really tell it wasn't ever designed to come apart, but with a little care it does come to bits without too much collateral damage. For the most part, the bits that are attached with screws come away quite easily, except where there's blobs of hot glue holding in the LEDs. You need to use some tweezers or some small pliers to work the hot glue back and forth until it loses its hold on the plastic. The second thing to look out for is quite a lot of the plastic clips have been melted over to lock them in. If you're really careful, you can work the parts a bit and carefully trim around the melted bits with a sharp knife until they free up, then pop them apart. Just be very careful not to stress the parts too much. The lenses are fairly brittle, and if you bend them too far, they are going to crack. The interior is a bit of a squeeze. Even after you remove the screws, you still need to bend the body a bit to get it past the sills. Just be very careful not to overdo it. The interior itself is very nice, especially for a toy car. We won't be doing any extra details to it. The all-black look is going to fit perfectly with the paint scheme that I have in mind. Inside the front bumper, we can see the locking clips that hold a lot of the black plastic parts in. They're really rather clever. Once the parts are clipped in, the body plastic flips back, stopping you from opening the clip, which is rather good on a toy-grade RC. It means those parts should never drop out, no matter how hard kids crash them into the skirting boards. But it does make them a bit of a pain to remove. I found using a screwdriver to bend the locking tabs right back did the trick. Then you can open the black plastic clip. It doesn't matter too much if the locking tabs snap off. The parts will still clip back in just fine. But the ones that don't snap, you can straighten them out for a bit of extra security. On the outside of the bumper there's two recessed fog lights. Currently they have some clear lenses in that just pop out from the inside. When we rebuild, rather than popping the lenses back in, I think I'm just going to drill them out and fit some white LEDs. It should look a bit neater, and of course they're going to light up. So there's the pile of bits that we've ended up with. We're going to need to go all over the body with some fine wet and dry to take the shine off, prime the plastic with primer, and paint. When done, and after letting it harden, we have something that looks like this. It's all black but with a mix of matte and gloss, inspired by the slightly questionable 2008 Knight Rider series. Okay, it was a different year Mustang, but it's close enough. The only mods that I've done to the body are the holes for the fogs. When I get around to setting up the lights, we're just going to pop in some 5mm LEDs. Much easier than trying to reuse those stock lenses. Putting the body back together is very straightforward. Unlike the Land Rover, there's no opening doors to worry about, and for the most part it really doesn't matter what order you reassemble. As long as you pop the windows and interior in before the other bits, you can't really go wrong. After some clipping and screwing, we have the body back together. It's not perfect, there's a couple of iffy bits where I overdid the lacquer a bit, and if you catch it in the light you can see where it's just started to run. I could sand it smooth and clean it up, but it's so minor you'd really have to try hard to get it on camera. The rest of the bits needed to assemble the steering have arrived, so we can start the proper build. I'm using some Select ball ends. Now they're more or less the same size as the Tamiya ones, but they're a lot tighter with zero slop. They can add a bit more load to the servo though, at least until they've been used enough to free up. We need one of the balls fitted to the steering linkage adapter. We just need to screw it in until it's all the way down. The steering linkage then just sits on the chassis. Now unfortunately the chassis isn't really designed with a steering servo in mind, so we're going to have to trim some of the plastic web that gets in the way of the ball. All we need to do is attack it with a Dremel and cut some of the webs down flush with the chassis. And while we got the Dremel out, we can get rid of all the webs in the battery box and pull all the terminals out. There's really not much to it, just Dremel it until it looks something like this. Now we'll be able to pop a LiPo in there with some space to spare. And back at the top, the ball end on the steering has enough clearance for the ball cup. As for the steering servo, I've got another MG90S, the cheapest little Metal Gear servo going. Actually, I ended up buying 10 of them. So far I've had a good experience with them, despite varying reviews. although in testing one of them did skip teeth if you applied a bit of force to the servo arm. I haven't had a chance to really find out why though, but from what I can see through the plastic the gears look fine, so it could be a missing bushing or something along those lines. Here's the mount we tried to fit earlier, and here's the updated mount. Now in theory it should still fit the Land Rover as well as the Mustang. There's 2 new slots along the top, and the servo's been dropped by 0.5 mm. There's also a small notch out the front, all relatively minor, but it does make the difference to it actually fitting. Also worth mentioning, I made up a mount for my dad's Range Rover Sport, and not too surprisingly it needed to be slightly different again. The slots along the top needed to be moved a little, and the bits on the side that take up the slot on the steering linkage were longer. Unfortunately, it's looking a lot like a universal servo mount isn't going to be possible. So far, 3 of the 3 models I've tried have all been just slightly different. When we get to the final fit, the servo slots into the mount, and there's a cap that fits over the top. The whole lot is then clamped up with a couple of screws. As always, it's a good idea to test all these small assemblies every so often during the build, just to make sure it all fits. It's really annoying when you finish an assembly, only to find out it doesn't quite fit and you have to strip it all down to modify. We're going to need a single straight arm that comes with the servo, along with one of the brass balls and a nut. I've drilled out, I think it was the 4th hole from the centre, and fitted a ball and a nut. There was also some excess thread that got cut off with a hacksaw, and while I was there I trimmed the end off the arm. With that ready to fit, we need to centre up the servo so we can get the arm at just the right angle. As usual, I'm going to use one of my servo testers. I've actually found some LCDs now that should be the right ones. However, I ordered them over a week ago and I've still not got any notification of them shipping. But you never know, they might turn up in a few weeks, in which case I can put together some servo testers for the store. Anyway, with the servo locked into its centre position, we can press the arm on. I found it works best if you just slightly off centre, with the ball a little bit closer to the near side of the servo. It'll make the arm close to 90 degrees to the linkage, which makes the servo fairly even left and right. Now you can clamp the servo back into the mount, and there's nothing special to do here. The mount's designed around these particular servos, so they should just drop straight in. Next we have the small linkage, which is nothing more than a couple of the select ball cups and a bit of M2 threaded rod in the middle. Very roughly we want a couple of millimeters gap between the ends. It's just a starting point now, we will probably have to adjust it a bit to get everything central. With the linkages all clipped together and the servo powered up, it's very easy to eyeball the adjustment. We just need the black linkage to be even on either side. The steering doesn't move very far, so the turning circle isn't going to be great. But to get around that, it's going to need quite a bit more design. I'm thinking about printing a replacement for the black linkage that will probably allow a bit more movement. I think we should end up being able to get at least a few more degrees at the wheels. Anyway, the servo mount can be refitted to the chassis with its 2 screws. The wheels can go back on too, not forgetting the springs, and the top plate with its 4 screws can go on too. So that's the servo in, with not really all that much to show for our effort. But it does look nice and clean with lots of space for all the other gubbins we need to make it go. First up we've got a new radio. I wanted something super cheap, separate from my usual GT3Bs. When I'm running the 1/14 trucks I like to plug the battery in and leave the truck and radio running all day, so I don't have to keep walking through the layout to turn everything back on. That means that sharing transmitters really doesn't work. I found this radio on eBay for well under 20 quid brand new. It doesn't have model memories, but it does have digital trims and endpoint adjustments, as well as a 3rd channel that we'd probably be able to use for lights. The only downside is it's a bit smaller than most transmitters, and it uses AAA batteries rather than AA, but for occasional use it should be more than up to the task. With a set of AAA Any-Loop rechargeables, it should last all day quite easily. The receiver it comes with is also rather small. Compared to the FlySky we normally use in the GT3s, which is already a small receiver, it does look very dinky. Perfect for the Rastar install. I'm going to use the servo tester in input mode now, so rather than send the pulses out to control the servo, it's going to be measuring the pulses from the receiver and showing us what's going on. The transmitter doesn't have a display, and the instructions aren't the most clear. It's somewhat lost in translation, I think. So this is going to help us see what's going on. On power up, it's pretty close to 1500 microseconds, or at least as close as any of the brand name radios, so that's good. We will need to turn the endpoints right down so we don't accidentally overstress the steering on the chassis. To set the endpoints, we have to hold the steering all the way at one end, then use the steering trim buttons to move the endpoints. It works, but it is a bit odd. You can see the graph on the display and the numbers going down as it changes. Now you can connect up the servo to the output of the servo tester as it passes the signal through, and we should find that we can go lock to lock on the transmitter without binding. Then we can flip the chassis over and do all the fine adjustment. It should just be a case of holding the wheel at one end and nudging the end point until we get as much lock as possible without stressing the servo. The rest of the electronics install is all pretty standard stuff. The steering servo plugs into channel 1 on the receiver, the ESC plugs into channel 2, the motor wires solder to the motor, and that's about it really. If you want to see a more detailed ESC install, have a look at the Defender build. It's exactly the same. The only real difference is we've got a lot more space to actually install them. There's space behind the servo for the receiver, and the ESC fits neatly up by the gearbox. We just need a bit of servo tape to make sure they're not rattling around when the body's back on. For the antenna, I'm just going to stick a bit of antenna tube between the front posts that the stock PCB was mounted to. A little bit of cyanoacrylate will do the job. Once it's dry, we can feed the antenna in, keeping it away from anything mechanical and keeping the end nice and straight. The only thing left to do on the chassis is open up a hole for the battery connector. Just as with the Land Rover, I forgot to drill one. It's not a problem though, just a quick grind with the Dremel is more than good enough. And there we are, one chassis ready to go. I always find it amazing just how minimal some installs look these days, especially with the small electronics. There's almost nothing there. So that just leaves popping the body back on. Now it does involve a bit of pulling and stretching to get it all the way down. The main thing is not to force it. If it's not going, adjust the position a bit and try again. When it's seated, we need to install the 8 self-tappers and reinstall the battery cover. And that's about it. It's ready for a battery and a quick test. As usual, we'll just use one of these 800 mAh 2S LiPos, which is more than enough for these little cars. They fit in the battery box with space to spare for the excess wire. There's some transmitter battery 2S LiPos around designed to replace 4 AA cells that would fit too, and they have a 2500 mAh capacity. I'm pretty sure you could probably drive all week with one of them. So with it all turned on, we can see how it actually works. Well, there's still not that much steering. If it's anything like the Land Rover, it's going to be just enough to comfortably get round the corners at the Midlands layout, just short of full lock. So just good enough. The motor sounds a bit weedy, so no burnouts or donuts, but for trundling around when there's some very expensive rigs sharing the road, it's probably for the best. And there we go then, another conversion complete. But we did skip over a few things, but I hope there's enough to give you an idea what you can do with a Mustang. Anyway, that's it for this week, so thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message after the tone. Bye guys!